I recognize the member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to address this bill this morning. Speaker, you won't be shocked to learn that I'm not a fan of this bill. And I hope in the course of the next few minutes to talk a bit about what things are in this bill that I find problematic. A few things. First off, there's nothing in this bill that will actually improve outcomes for students or ensure that they have smaller class sizes. If you're concerned about what's happening in our schools, if you're concerned about the future of the next generation, you should be talking about those issues. They should be at the center of what you're doing. That is not going to be something coming out of this bill. There's not a focus on special education or mental health supports. And as I talk to teachers, I talk to parents, and frankly, as I talk to students, they say to me, we aren't seeing the resources in those areas that we need to see. And I'm not seeing in this bill any commitment to ensuring that those resources are there. In fact, there are not even commitments to basic resources like pencils. Now, I know the minister has said we'll be giving an allowance to each teacher so that they can buy pencils and paper and so on. I know this sounds strange, but typically in an organization, you have a budget for supplies and you make sure they're adequate supplies so that if a teacher needs supplies for a classroom, they can go to a storage room and get them. The idea that they have not been properly funded and that you have to have a special allowance for teachers does not make sense. That is not good purchasing policy. This bill doesn't put students first. This is about making sure that the Minister of Education is in a far stronger position than that minister has been in the past. And as you are well aware, the amount of money that's being spent per student, adjusted for inflation, has been dropping. So if you actually think that students are important, if you think that education is important, you would be ensuring that budgets were inflation adjusted and that the students were getting the inputs they need to be successful. This bill gives the minister more power, and it seems, frankly, to be set up to discourage people from running to be a trustee. And that's of interest to me in part because the minister has said that if there are situations where people don't run, then he will be appointing trustees. I don't think having a minister appoint the trustees on a board of education makes sense, certainly not in terms of responsibility to the people as a whole. I know that democracy is a weird idea. Winston Churchill once said it was the worst of all possible systems except for the others. And I think that election of decision makers makes a lot of sense in an open society. When I talk to people who are unhappy with the trustee, I say, vote them out. There's going to be an election. You don't think they're up to snuff? Vote them out. Run yourself if you think you're in a position to do that. And if you're not in a position to do that, find someone else who you think is good, support them. I think vesting the power in the minister, who is effectively untouchable by the mass of parents, does not make sense in an open and free society. It's a substantial mistake. Now, it's interesting that the bill mentions liability 43 times while mentioning students 5 times and classrooms 0 times. It's been interesting to me to watch the bills coming forward from this government that consistently include a clause or multiple clauses protecting the minister or civil servants from legal liability for carrying out the act. And I don't remember that being a feature of bills in the past. I think I would have noticed it. You have to ask, what is it in the minds of the politicians who direct the drafting of these bills that they think they need protection from legal action? Is it that they understand the consequences of what they're doing and realize that it's going to lead to legal action on the part of parents, teachers, communities? Or is it just an all-purpose, I don't like to have anyone giving me a hard time approach to life? Not clear to me. So, some of the new powers for the minister: establishing policies that assess student achievement, during the technical briefing that our caucus staff got, they said this was so the minister can require exams for all grade 9 to 12 students and change how grades are calculated across the province to have one standard that includes attendance. I don't have a particular rejection of the idea of exams, but it may be that in different school boards and in different schools with different populations, you need to have a different method of assessing student achievement, a different method of determining what is actually being learned, and a different method of understanding how to get students to perform at their peak. This bill gives the minister power to set regulations regarding budgets, including giving himself the power to approve board budgets in certain circumstances and banning school boards from paying certain expenses. In the briefing, ministry staff said the minister would approve budgets when trustees don't approve the CEO's budget, which basically means trustees are at the mercy of the CEO and his budget. So you have to ask, if the trustees actually can't decide what the budget is for their board, if the CEO gets to run back to daddy and say, they don't like my budget, they're not voting for my budget. You know, we need to cut a lot of teachers, we need to cut a lot of support staff, we need bigger classes, and they're resisting that. Minister, please step in and make sure that my budget is passed. That's effectively what's happening here. So you have a continued shell of elected trustees, but in fact the power has shifted fundamentally away from local communities and to the minister. Now I know, and some people in the House may dispute this, that Toronto is not popular in the rest of Ontario. And so my colleagues have said to me, you know, I even got applause for that line. Some colleagues have said to me the best line they have is, do you really want some person in Toronto deciding what happens in your community? No. Well, see, I got even more support for that. So the idea that the minister is setting things up so that the old line, hey, it's just Toronto dictating again, is actually made real. It is made real. Local boards of trustees will essentially be subject to the minister, and in many ways they will be flag catchers. I don't think that this is a good way to operate any sort of democratic system. And I have to note as well the move by the minister to reduce the number of trustees, cap the number of trustees in a board. So in Toronto there are 22 trustees. This will be brought down to 12. Roughly one trustee for every 2 ridings. Speaker, as you're well aware, the average size of a riding is 100,000 people. So that means one trustee for 200,000 people. 200,000 is bigger than most cities and communities in this province. It is a problematic number. I thought one trustee for 100,000 was a problem, but for 200,000, it makes it extraordinarily difficult for anyone to actually deal on a day-to-day basis with the concerns that people bring about their child's education. And I'll say to the members sitting on the government side, if you're not doing casework in education now, believe me, you'll be doing it in the future. I've been getting that education casework because people realize that the power is shifted from the board to the minister. And it is extraordinarily difficult for us as MPPs to do that on top of the other casework that we do. But the reality is, when you're a parent and your child has got a problem in a school is not working properly, you are going to jump in. You are going to jump in. And there are vast seas of detail that one has to address when one is addressing education. What this will mean is that increasingly parents will not actually be able to have the advocacy for their children or their communities that they need to have. That is a big step backwards in a democratic society. It is a fundamental mistake on the part of this government. The bill gives expanded powers to the minister to determine what constitutes a valid trustee expense, including the power to block payment of expenses to certain persons or for certain purposes. You know, If a trustee or any politician makes a stupid spending mistake, then they should be held accountable in the court of public opinion. That should damage them politically. People should know about that. But to have the minister determining what is a valid expense or not, as opposed to having the people decide, that is a mistake. That gives the minister power, should they decide to exercise it, to be vindictive in dealing with the expenses of any individual trustee. That is not the role of the provincial government in a democratic society. That is the role of the electorate. Now, that electorate needs to be well informed. There needs to be the media coverage that will surface those bad actors. But that's what democracy is about. That's what democracy is about. The bill will set communications policies for boards that will include, quote, public communications made by board members acting as representatives of the board. Well, in fact, this could put us in a situation where the minister doesn't like what a trustee is saying about the situation they're facing. Maybe a trustee is saying to their parents, hey, there have been ongoing cuts to education budgets, and that is affecting our ability to provide appropriate class sizes, appropriate supports in the school, appropriate staffing in the school. If you're upset, go to the minister. The minister will be in a position to disallow that and only allow happy talk in the notes coming out from trustees or the emails coming out from trustees. That does not make any sense. Again, if a trustee is communicating inappropriately, vote them out. If any of us are behaving inappropriately, behaving inappropriately, vote us out. That is the way things get corrected in a democratic system and the way we need to have things set up. Because if, in fact, decision makers are not accountable to the public, you get bad decisions. Again, Churchill was right. Democracy is profoundly flawed, but better than all the other flawed systems. The boards will now have to have the minister's approval to acquire new land. And this worries me because, as you're well aware with this government, games around land seem to be a pretty common thing. Well, one member has said this is what this is all about, and that member may be entirely correct. We went through the Greenbelt scandal where the Premier was giving effectively an $8.6 billion gift to a bunch of his buddies, people who had come to his daughter's wedding, an outcome that is now under investigation by the RCMP. We had decisions about a landfill in Dresden, Ontario, where prior to an election, the government pulled back and said, no, we'll have full environmental assessment. As soon as the election's over, boom, the landfill goes ahead. And again, it was pointed out widely in the media that the owners of that landfill had very close financial connections with the ruling party. The potential for abuse of the public purse and the public trust are profound. And turning that over to the minister, particularly in a government that has shown on an ongoing basis its, let's say, weakness to pressure from buddies who are going to make big bucks, is not a good idea. Not a good idea for education, not a good idea for the public purse. The minister can appoint someone to oversee a capital project, including building, expanding, renovating, or repairing a school building. And that includes every component, including the contracts. Seriously? Seriously, you're going to have a management of a, I guess in Toronto's case, a multi-billion-dollar corporation where the minister reaches in to mess with every contract? If you're talking about red tape, if you're talking about decision-making being, what can I say, lost in a maze of approvals, this is a classic example. If you've got a board of education, you've got elected trustees, you have professional managers, let them make those decisions. And if they mess up, vote them out. Vote them out. And if they do good, re-elect them. But having effectively, the minister inserted at every layer of substantial decision-making in a Board of Education does not make sense. Interestingly, this line, boards need approval to create or continue to operate a school board-controlled entity. And it was pointed out by our critic that there are not a lot of examples of school board-controlled entities in Ontario beyond the Toronto Lands Corporation. And one has to ask if, in fact, that's the aim here. Because the Toronto Lands Corporation has control of school board properties. And the opportunity for development and the opportunity for speculative profits from development on school lands are immense, particularly in Toronto. And I have to say that there's often a short-sighted approach to school lands. I represent Toronto-Danforth. A few decades ago, a school at Logan and Danforth, Franklin, was scheduled for closure, demolition, and sale of land. And the local community fought hard against that, and they were successful. They were able to retain the school. Within a decade of that saving of the school playground was full of portables because the demographics had changed. People or families that dominated in that neighborhood, which had had their children, people were moving into their 50s, 60s, and 70s, didn't have kids anymore. The attendance at the school dropped. Those people moved out, passed on. Whole new generation came in with kids, and the school was flooded. And so I've seen over the decades the portables expand and shrink, expand and shrink. There are demographic waves. And you have to know that in a city like Toronto, frankly, Hamilton, Sarnia, Windsor, you're going to get demographic waves. And when you lose that school property, your ability to get that property back so that you can actually provide that service is close to nil, So we have to, I believe, safeguard that property. And having this government, with all its focus on land deals, suddenly have access to a big portfolio of what will be extraordinarily valuable land in the City of Toronto is something that I find very disturbing, very worrying. Now, the bill, again, as I noted, 57 clauses regarding protection of the minister, cabinet, and the minister's appointees against legal cases, but only one clause on student achievement. That is a real concern.
I thought they were tough on crime.
Yeah, someone has just said, I thought they were tough on crime. If you are constantly trying to pull yourself out of the legal system, if you have written this bill and you understand that you may be in deep legal trouble, then I can see why you would be writing in all this get-out-of-jail-free card stuff into the bill. I don't think that serves the public purpose. I think that it makes sense that those who make decisions have to live with the consequences of those decisions. And this sort of thing says no. I have to touch on two other things in the brief time left to me. One is that we've got a huge problem in Ontario with a lack of teachers, and teachers effectively being demoralized and driven out of the system. And that is something that causes disruption in individual classrooms and in individual schools. I have teachers come to me and say, why do they have such a low opinion of teachers? Why are we seen as a problem and not as a solution to a problem? And I think this government has done a lot to demoralize teachers. And I want to talk very briefly about the question of truancy. I noted there was an interesting article in the Star this morning about how truancy has soared since the pandemic. And really, at the beginning of the beginning of the current government's term in 2018, truancy was a lot less than it is now. Has anyone done an analysis of what this government's policies have done to cause a huge increase in truancy? Is this something related to the way the education system is running, or is it related to a tougher and tougher economic environment in which students are increasingly taking work outside of school to keep their families afloat and to change? Oh, well.
I recognize the member from Orleans.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I listened intently to your presentation. Thank you very much. I do agree with you that if things were reduced to $200,000 per trustee, that would be a lot of constituents to try to represent. I think, though, that representation forgets the fact that there are, in fact, 4 different school boards. And so trustees don't represent the entirety of the population. They represent the people who vote within that school board. And I'm hoping it doesn't reveal, perhaps, your view that there should only be one school board. And so I'm hoping you can reiterate your support for fully funded Catholic and French education in Ontario.
Response?
Well, I don't often say this, but thank you. That is a really good question, and I'm very appreciative. Yes, we need to have Francophone education. We need to have Catholic education. We need a full range of publicly funded education in this province so that all communities are included and equally respected. In terms of the number of trustees, I think that local communities should determine how many representatives they need. What is the number that is appropriate to ensure that the board is responsive and accountable? And so having the minister put a cap on the number of trustees doesn't make sense to me. Obviously, when you're talking about a place like Barrie Innisfil, or you're talking
Response.
about... You didn't like that response, Speaker? I thought it was a great response. The number of trustees should reflect the population and the will of the people in that community.
I recognize the member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Speaker. I listened to the member opposite. Accountability. We all agree in this House that accountability is important, and I think that everyone in this House, specifically the parents, I'm a mother, and showing up to class for my kids was a priority. It is a priority, and students attending class in high school should be a priority, full stop. And this legislation makes attendance part of our students' marks. An idea that I should mention came from the teachers. Will the member opposite support our students and our teachers by supporting this bill, an obvious thing for everyone in Ontario, or Canada for that matter?
Response.
Well, I thank the member for the question. I think the question of attendance is a really substantive one. And if we are seeing dramatic reduction in the percentage of students attending on a regular basis, that's something that needs to be addressed. So the question that I think the government has to answer is, why are we seeing the drop in attendance? What is causing that? Are there socioeconomic factors that are causing that? Are there problems with the way the schools are operating? Is that causing the problem? Will, in fact, what's being proposed increase attendance, or will it simply mean that students in difficult circumstances are going to be penalized for not showing up? I think the first task of any government is to understand the basis for something happening so that you can take corrective action. And I have seen no analysis.
Response.
What is it that caused a big drop from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic? What caused that drop? If the government can show the studies